So I do thank everyone for being here this evening and for this opportunity to speak to you. Now this is just a short lesson from the book of Joshua. We'll be looking at Joshua chapter 14. The main idea of the lesson is that the Israelites are trusting God. They are doing what He commanded them through Moses in the past. They are actually doing what they should do. Now there is also going to be a little bit of the negative that we will see as well, but that's because some of the choices that are made are not the best. But the primary part of this, I've decided to call this lesson Trusting God, Joshua chapter 14. And this chapter is actually primarily about Caleb receiving Hebron as was promised to him, but we're not going there. We're going to look at the first five verses of Joshua chapter 14. And these first five verses, they talk about how the land is to be divided among the tribes. And it's a summary. It's pretty brief. It's a brief summary of what we're going to see in the next chapters in Joshua. As we go through those chapters, it will detail the division of the land. So we'll look at Joshua chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, and that's the summary that we're going to be focusing on. Now, for the most part, they are trusting God and following what they are supposed to do here. And it's good to have that positive example, which this primarily is. If we look at Joshua chapter 14, verses 1 through 5, these are the areas which the children of Israel inherited in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest, Joshua the son of Nun, and the heads of the fathers of the tribes of the children of Israel distributed as an inheritance to them. Their inheritance was by lot, as the Lord had commanded by the hand of Moses, for the 9 tribes and the half-tribe. For Moses had given the inheritance of the 2 tribes and the half-tribe on the other side of the Jordan, but to the Levites he had given no inheritance among them. For the children of Joseph were 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they gave no part to the Levites in the land except cities to dwell in with their common lands for their livestock and their property. As the Lord had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did, and they divided the land. Now, as a reminder, if you read Joshua to this point in chapter 13, Joshua's older now. He's at an advanced age, and it's time to go ahead and divide the land up between the tribes. It's time to go ahead and give them their inheritance of land. And there's still much land to possess. They've not driven everyone out of the promised land, so there's still much that they have to take possession of, and the tribes will need to finish that work after they get their allotted portion of land. They will still need to drive those people out. Now the territories, if you look at this map, the territories on the east side or on the right side of the Jordan had been established and given by the Lord through Moses. On that right side, you'll see those 3 territories for the 2.5 tribes, East Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. So basically, the 9.5 tribes on the west side, and that half again is the other half of Manasseh. If you think of East Manasseh, then maybe think of West Manasseh over on the other side. So this is due to the fact that Joseph was promoted to a firstborn and got a double portion from Jacob. However, on the map you won't see Joseph because of the way this was done. The land instead was given to Manasseh and Ephraim because Jacob adopted Joseph's sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, as his own. So you won't see any territory of Joseph, but it'll be Manasseh and Ephraim. So just wanted to try to make that clear. It's a little different, but so now it's time for them to actually distribute the rest of the land on the west side. And this map actually shows the results of that. So this is that time when they're going to cast those lots for that. And only the land on the west side of the Jordan is called Canaan. And it was actually the promised land. that land on the west side, that is the promised land, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants. Technically, the 2.5 tribes on the east side, those on the farther side away from me, East Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, technically they are not even in the promised land. God allowed them to stay there, but they are not in the promised land. And they did help Joshua, at least to this point. They had been helping Joshua and the tribes drive those people out and conquer the land to this point. So, one thing to remember about the people that were being driven out of this land, and in some cases they were killed, they were evil people. They were idolaters. They sacrificed their children. These people had rejected any knowledge of God. And the fact that Israel did not completely drive these evil people out, in the long run, that really hurt Israel. We see that down through the Old Testament as we continue. So we also need to remember that as creator of all the earth, that God, as the creator of all the earth, He is the king. He is just, and He can determine who has what land as He sees fit. He sees and knows more than we do, and we can trust that He knows what He's doing. And I know this runs contrary to society today, but God is still on His throne. He is sovereign, and He is just, and He is merciful. And if His judgment was on these other people for their sin, for their evil, He has every right to judge. He has every right to do that. Just as He did for Sodom and Gomorrah, and just as we will all face a judgment day. So we do not have that right. We cannot put ourselves in the place of God, but God has that right. And we can trust Him as the creator of all the earth to also be the judge of all the earth. So, some things to notice here in our verses. If we look at verse 1, the order of the people that are mentioned. Eleazar, the priest, he's mentioned first because he is the high priest. He actually has the lead role in this, as he will cast the lots using the Urim and Thummim. And I may not be saying those right, but it's those two special stones they use for casting lots. And verse 2 says this was commanded by the Lord through Moses. Moses is mentioned several times here, reminding us that this was ordered years earlier by the Lord through Moses. The Urim and the Thummim, those were those special stones. They would cast those, and God would cause the outcome on those stones so that would give them an answer. God had told them to do this back in Numbers chapter 27, verse 21. We'll look at that later. Again, through Moses, this made sure that God was in control. This was not chance. There was no cheating. There was no personal choice or favoritism shown. This was all according to God. Now, verse 3 mentions the tribes that we looked at on the east side of the Jordan, and the Levites had no inheritance in that land. Now, they will still get cities, but this is just saying that they had no inheritance in the land. This ends up being the same, really, for all the tribes. In verse 4, we do see that the Levites are given cities and adjacent pasture lands to dwell in, and this was from all the tribes in all the areas. And this is covered in detail in chapter 21. So remember, the Levites are the priestly tribe, and they're there to serve in the tabernacle and later the temple, and they're supposed to be the spiritual leaders, and that is the obvious idea. Of course, some of them had different roles within the Levite tribe, different things such as maintenance, or if we remember the tabernacle, some of them were responsible for moving certain things, and they had different roles. Others were actual priests or assistants to the priests in some ways, and at this time, Eleazar was the high priest. He was the high priest. So, if we look here, these are the final allotments or inheritance mentioned in verse 5. I don't know about you, to me, this looks very weird. I would have wanted things to be all nice and neat and squares or regular shapes, that's just me. But this is how the Lord divided the land. Now, there was one thing in my studies of this that was mentioned, that there is a tradition with some Jews, I'm not going to say all of them, but some of them claimed the lots were done in some other fashion rather than using the casting of the stones, the Urim and Thummim. However, it plainly states in verse 2, as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses. So if we look back at that verse in Numbers that we mentioned earlier, Numbers chapter 27, verse 21, now the he here, he's talking about Joshua. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, all the congregation. So here we see that Eleazar was to inquire of the Lord for Joshua, using the stones, casting them as a lot. That was their prescribed method, allowing God's providence to tell them what to do. So the idea that they did as the Lord commanded, tells us that they did cast lots. They did not do the proposed idea that I read about was something about slips of paper in different pots, and I don't know, it didn't make good sense to me. But we see here from the word that they actually did cast the lots using the stones like they were supposed to. So there's no doubt that's what they did. I just wanted to mention this so you would know if you ever run into that, if you ever hear of that, you would know. Now verse 5 is a summary of what we'll see like in the next chapters as the land is divided and given to the different tribes. These are things, Lord willing, that we'll go over in future lessons. But looking at these verses, at these, what lessons can we learn or pull from these verses? What self-examination can we do? Can we apply any of this to ourselves personally? Just a few ideas to think about. Are we following God's instructions, or are we leaving things to chance? Are we doing things, my way or God's way? Are we separated from the life God has for us? Have we removed ourselves from God's people? Are we trusting God? The 9.5 tribes on the west side, they followed God's plan. And it was given to them years earlier by Moses. And they were trusting God and not chance. This was his plan. And God has a plan for each of us if we will follow the Lord. Doing things the human way, my way, leads to destruction. We need to make sure that we're doing things God's way as he has told us. And for us today, that is following the Lord, following Jesus and his teachings. Luke chapter 6, verse 46, but why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say? Again, that disobedience leads to destruction. And we don't want to abandon gathering together with the Lord's people. We want to make sure that we're not staying outside of that promised land. The 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan, they thought they knew better than God. They saw this land, they thought it was great pasture land, and that's what they wanted. Now here today, the kingdom of God is not divided by a river. Instead, we separate ourselves from the Lord and from the kingdom by having hard hearts, by being prideful, by thinking we don't need God's family. And this is harmful to us, and it's a harmful example to set. We are a family, and we are meant to be helpful to each other. But we can't help people we don't know. We can't lean on each other if we're not around each other. So are we trusting God? Have we put our faith and trust in him? Have we given him our eternal soul and life? Are we trusting Jesus, knowing that he will keep that safe for us and that he will bring us into that eternal promised land? In closing, we need to ask ourselves, are we in God's kingdom? The 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan were not in the promised land. They chose to stay separated on the east side of the Jordan. They followed their side, what they thought was good, instead of God's plan. And then what happened to them? If we look at 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verses 25 and 26, and they were unfaithful to the God of their fathers, and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is, and I'm going to have trouble saying this, so let's just bear with me, Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria. He carried the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh into captivity. He took them to Halah, Habor, Hara, and the river of Gozan to this day. Again, I may not be saying those correctly, but this shows once we start straying from God's plan, when we start straying from what He's teaching us, it's easy to just go farther and farther away and drift further and further away from the Lord. They began to worship idols, and they ended up being taken by the Assyrians. And when we see the map, and you're familiar with this map if you've been in the Matthew class, and we look on the right side, the east side of the Jordan, that's all Gentile land. None of those people are there. They're gone. It could be that they have some descendants mixed in somewhere among some people, but it's not an Israel territory. It's not Manasseh anymore. It's not Reuben. It's not Gad. It's Gentile territory. They're gone. They chose not to be in the promised land, and they're not in God's kingdom at this point with His people. So they suffered for that choice. So I'll ask again, are you in God's kingdom? This is the most important question of your eternal life. Have you found the eternal treasure of salvation? Have you made Jesus the King of your life? Are you trusting and obeying the Lord? Have you repented of sin and confessed Jesus as the Son of God? And if Jesus comes back today, are you ready? Have you been baptized? If you're not ready, or if you have any doubts, we would be happy to help you with that today, this evening. Not in any rush, and we ain't got anywhere else to be. So if you need to be baptized for salvation, or if you need prayers or anything that we could help you with this evening, please come forward as we stand and sing.